Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. And today, we're talking about a comic book that Steve Donoghue's gonna hate. We're going to be talking about The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead. The original comic book, The Walking Dead. Not the television show, The Walking Dead, although we pretty much have to talk about the television show a little bit if we're talking about this. This story, created by Robert Kirkman. And it was a long running horror comic book about the zombie apocalypse, the ever popular zombie apocalypse. And The Walking Dead is one of the zombie stories that brought zombies back. Zombies had kind of shuffled away for a while. Zombies, which made their appearance in this form in Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, in Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. That series of films created a kind of zombie and created the zombie apocalypse. And that in itself was influenced by Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which was a vampire story about the vampire apocalypse. But there was a space of time when zombies were not quite as popular as a monster for a while. But then they started coming back, and they came back big time when The Walking Dead, this comic book from Image Comics, became a television show. But I am going to be talking about the original Kirkman comic book series. There's quite a bit of it. I've got it all here. I've got the big compendium volumes. I'm not going to hold them all up because they're heavy. But this is how I read the bulk of it, the bulk of The Walking Dead. Although I did start reading it before these were released, and I started reading The Walking Dead a while before the television show came out. So I was already familiar with the story and the series by 2010. I think it was 2010 when the show came out. Comic book started, if I'm remembering right, in 2003. Right around there. And I remember the first time I read The Walking Dead. This is divided up into books. And each book, I think, is like 5 or 6 issues. Chapters, I should say, or about 5 or 6 issues. And the first part was illustrated by Tony Moore, who was quite a different illustrator than what we would get later. This is one of the earlier scenes from The Walking Dead, the original comic book, when Rick Grimes, our police officer hero, who has been in the hospital recovering from a bullet wound, wakes up to find the whole world has been taken over by zombies, as zombies tend to do in movies. Take over everything, you know. Wouldn't quite happen like that in real life, but, you know, zombies wouldn't happen in real life, so there you go. I always liked zombie movies, George Romero's zombie movies, when I was younger. I was a fan of those when I was a kid and a teenager. So this was fun. It was fun to see a comic book zombie story. And in the first graphic novel collection, Kirkman wrote a little introduction. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm trying to remember it as best I can. But a couple of things I do remember him saying in that introduction. One was that he always wondered what happened in the world of the zombie apocalypse after the movie finished. He wanted a zombie story that just kind of went on and on and on, so you would continue following a story in a zombie-ridden planet. And he also wanted to create this character for this story, Rick Grimes, who would end up very different as a character by the end of the story than he was in the beginning of the story. He wanted it so that this character would develop and change because of his situation, because of him trying to survive and be a leader in this world overrun with zombies and a bunch of horrible people, because most people in The Walking Dead seem to be pretty horrible for whatever reason. And he wanted his character, Rick Grimes, to be a very different person by, the end of the story, if he ever got to it. And he was successful in that. He was successful with a lot with this series, I think. It's not the greatest comic book series of all time. It is a horror comic, and it functions as a horror comic. But it's also a survival story. Although, it's more of a horror comic, I think, than a survival story. It's interesting. There are a lot of good things about it, and there are some bad things about it. I think the good far outweighs the bad, though. I have to say, the character work in this is really good and better than I would have expected, or better than I did expect when I started following this series. I remember finding it engaging in the first book, it was a very entertaining zombie story, the first graphic novel, which is part of this first compendium. These things are huge, these compendiums that Image puts out. When the artist changed from Tony Moore to Charlie Adlard. And when that first change occurred, this is Adlard's first page, I wasn't really on board. I wasn't really sold on this artist's style. But Adlard developed and changed as an artist over time. It didn't actually take him long to do, to really get the hang of this book and to make this series his own and to give everything his own distinctive look. And he really did. He has some deficiencies as an artist, I think, but they're more than made up for by his strengths, which are moodiness, humanity. He's really good at bringing out the humanity of the characters in the story. And he has some just terrifically creepy scenes of zombie horror. One thing about the comic book, if you compare it to the television show, as grim and terrible as the television show could be, the comic book was a lot more violent and a lot darker. It also, oddly enough, always felt more real. I feel like this story works better as a comic book for a number of reasons. Well, we'll talk about it. Let's talk about that. With the comic book, Kirkman had the freedom to tell the story that he wanted to. Now, this went 4 compendiums long, 4 books this size. I think it probably went on longer than it had to. Certainly in the latter half of the series, it did have that feeling like, is this just going to go on forever? But it was still good. The quality was still good. It just felt like it was turning its wheels a little bit. And I think to his credit, Kirkman kind of realized that. He realized that he had gone as far as he could go with this story and said, you know what, we've just got to end it. This is the point where we got to end this story. This is the right part. He could have just kept writing and drawing this story forever, just kept bringing in the money, because at this point, The Walking Dead was a big deal because of the television show. But he didn't. He brought the story to a satisfying conclusion. And it was a good conclusion, I have to say. The ending of the comic book, which I will not spoil, because you should read it, actually, if you're interested in horror and you're interested in comic books, and you haven't read this, read it. It's very different from the show in a lot of ways. In one way, it had a good, satisfying conclusion. He was able to keep the characters alive that he wanted to keep alive, kill off the characters he wanted to kill off. And I have to say, when I was reading this, before the show ever came out, one of the draws for this book is because you did become invested in the characters. You do become invested in the characters in this book. And reading it as a monthly comic, as I did after I read the first couple graphic novels, I was picking it up monthly for a while. You really wondered what was going to happen next. It was one of those books you really wanted to pick up because you were really concerned about your characters and their situation, and it was always engaging. At least right up until that back half that I was talking about, where it slowed down, I feel, a bit. It functions better than the television show in a lot of ways. First of all, let's just talk zombies. Now, you don't have to be a medical genius to know that the whole idea of a zombie is ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea of The Walking Dead is completely absurd. Right, Roger? Roger totally agrees. I mean, if anyone would know, it's Roger. So the whole idea of a zombie is silly. But possibly because of Adler's art, it works really well in the comic. In the movies, it never works as well. There's always that bit in your mind where you know that the zombies are just people in makeup. You know that they're not real. You really get that sense in the television show. Now, I watched the television show. I thought the first couple seasons were good. First 3 seasons actually were worth watching. They were good. But for me, well, first of all, it had that thing what series television tends to have, serialized television, where they try to drag everything out forever. I thought the first season of The Walking Dead was pretty solid for what it was, which was a zombie movie, 6 episodes long or whatever the first season was. By the second season of The Walking Dead, they were stretching things out quite a bit. But there were still good stuff in that show. There's some good stuff in that show, at least in the first few seasons. But eventually, the show just kind of really dragged on. Like the deficiencies that you saw in the back. Sorry about that. I got a phone call. I forgot to turn the phone. Never mind. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. The deficiencies that you see a little bit in the back half of the comic book series were all over the television show. It just at some point stopped working for me, the show. It stopped becoming something you just were intrigued by or entertained by for me. And I just dropped away. I stopped caring about the show. I never did feel that way about the comic book. And one of the things with the television show is, if you're familiar with the comic, you can see where all of the changes, and there are multiple changes in the story. The basic arc is sort of the same up until around the end, sort of. But a lot of the things were changed just because of necessities, actors having to come and go. Carl, the character of Carl, our hero's son, Rick's son, was aging tremendously fast for the story. He just kept getting taller and taller. Where in the comic book he could just stay a kid. Who knows how much time actually passed in the television show? It's all kind of nebulous. And then eventually, spoiler, this is a spoiler if you haven't seen the television show, they killed off Carl, which was one of the whole points of the story, is Rick trying to keep his kid alive. And it was like that. Some characters would die that wouldn't die in the show or wouldn't die in the comic because actors had to leave or wanted to leave for whatever reason, the show. There were changes like that, which I guess are unavoidable when you're running a television show. But when you have a comic book, you can tell the story you want to tell. If it's something like this, you don't have to worry about that. You can just tell the story you want to tell. And as a result, it just works better. So oddly enough, even though it's a comic, the characters always felt a bit more real to me. The zombies seemed scarier in the comic than they did on screen, because on screen they just always seemed like movie zombies. And probably that's because in a comic you have to give your imagination more of a free rein. And the story just worked better. And so if you've seen the show and you like the show, you'll probably really like the comic. Now, there are characters in the show that don't exist in the comic. The comic is a different thing. But it's a better thing, I think. It's a better thing. It told its story, concluded maybe a little late, but basically when it had to, and with a satisfying conclusion. So it tells an actual story with a beginning, middle, and end. And as a story of horror, it's really, really good. It's really, really good. Now, you're going to go and watch Steve Donoghue's video, and it'll probably be 10 minutes long where he just talks about how much it sucks and how much he hates horror. I knew when I picked this that Steve wouldn't like it, but what do? You have to talk about The Walking Dead because it's such an odd success story. It started off as this little zombie comic published by Image Comics, which you didn't know how long it was going to go on. You never know with comic books. And it became this huge thing. And for most people, The Walking Dead comic book is something that they've never even looked at. Even fans of the show, I don't think, have always watched or have always read the comic. It's just such a different thing. And it spawned something so huge. I think the Walking Dead television phenomenon is definitely on its last legs at this point. I know they're still pumping stuff out, but really its heyday is long past, I suspect. But the comic books continue to exist and will always remain as strong as they are because it tells a solid story, really moody, really good art. You care about these characters. It's awesome. It's awesome. Very violent, incredibly violent. When I read these, it was some of the most brutal stuff I've ever read in a comic. But it kept you reading. You had to keep finding out what was going to happen. And Roger's actually a huge fan. Roger's not actually always a fan of the comic books I read. But The Walking Dead, oddly enough, is one of his favorites. Go figure. So that's all I have to say about The Walking Dead today. A darn good comic book that you should read if you like horror. And I will catch you next time.